I will be happy to introduce, first of all, John Reuwer, who is a member of the board of directors of World Beyond War. He's based in Vermont in the US. He's a retired emergency physician whose practice convinced him of a crying need for alternatives to violence for resolving tough conflicts, which led him to the informal study and teaching of nonviolence for the last 35 years, with peace team field experience in Haiti, in Colombia, in Central America, in Palestine and Israel, and in several US cities. And also recently in South Sudan, he worked with the Nonviolent Peace Force, one of very few organizations practicing professional unarmed civilian peacekeeping. John practiced that in South Sudan. To read more about John Reuwer, check out the link in the chat. Take it away, John.
I'll go ahead and introduce Charles too, since we're going to go back and forth.
Well, our next speaker will be Charles Johnson, who is a co-founding member of Nonviolent Peace Force's Chicago chapter. With the chapter, Charles works to promote and practice Unarmed Civilian Protection, UCP, a proven unarmed alternative to armed protection. He has received certification in UCP studies through the UN/Merrimack College and has trained in UCP with Nonviolent Peace Force, with DC Peace Team, with Meta Peace Team, and others. So John and Charles, take it away.
All right, I'm going to start with the screen sharing here and go right to the slides. So the belief that violence or the threat of violence is the ultimate way to protect ourselves and the things we love is a deeply held belief for most people that I've met in most places in the world. And that very belief in violence is what leads us to endless gun violence, endless harm, and endless war that threatens everything we actually value. And if we're going to overcome war, we have to come up with an alternative that makes people feel as safe as they think violence keeps them. The World Beyond War's Alternative Global Security document, which is a living catalog of the alternatives that would make people safer, is a collection of such things. One of the most exciting about those is what is now termed unarmed civilian protection. How can communities keep them safe without violent authorities lording it over them? And so we'll give you a brief explanation of that, our experience with it, and open up for discussion about how we can do more with this. So if the pictures are in the way, you have a little thing in the top corner that allows you to shrink the number of pictures interfering with the slides, if that would suit you. So unarmed civilian protection comes from a concern about violence by communities, especially when the authorities do not protect those communities, or the authorities are actually part of the cause of violence toward those communities. In my research and experience has shown me there's been at least 4 threads of human engagement that have led to very similar outcomes in what we now call protecting ourselves, or unarmed civilian protection, UCP. Community watch, conflict resolution, peace teams, and a medical model. And it's not switching here, there we go. So the idea of protecting communities is ancient. The biblical book of Ezekiel talks about the town watchman who watches over the city and warns of impending doom. Medieval Europe had watchmen in most towns that were unarmed except with lanterns and bells to warn people of danger. In the United States in 1972, the National Sheriff's Association started a formal program for teaching neighborhoods how to watch out for themselves. And you can see these signs in many communities throughout the United States. Neighborhood watches have a great variation in their activity, from people timidly peeking out from behind the curtain and calling the police if they see something, to the guardian angels, if you've heard of them, young people who, with a certain amount of toughness, go out and began on the New York subways to try to keep people safer. From the field of conflict resolution, we have the work of William Ury, who became famous by co-authoring the book Getting to Yes, one of the real Bibles of negotiation. He spent his career trying to resolve conflicts and came up with a concept that he wrote up in a book called Getting to Peace that was later changed to The Third Side, because he talks about conflicts as being primarily between two opposing sides that may have allies or not, but that there's a third side, the people all around them, that are greatly affected by that conflict. Who are they? First of all, the insiders, the people that know the parties in conflict, the family, friends, the allies, and so forth. And then there's the rest of the people that are affected. So for example, when you live in a city with neighborhood violence, it becomes dangerous. It limits your ability to safely go into that area of the city, or so you may think. With the war in the Ukraine, it's primarily Russia and Ukraine at this point, but the whole globe is outsiders, and we're affected by rising food prices, rising fuel prices, and so forth. And Yuri's point is that the third side is almost always bigger than either side or even both sides in the conflict, and therefore can have a great influence on how that conflict is carried out. The third perspective is from what we call peace teams. And this was an idea, as far as I know, that got started with Gandhi in the 1920s, when Mohandas Gandhi had practiced for some years mobilizing large numbers of people to do nonviolent actions. He realized that there was still a lot of violence within the Indian communities, a lot of rioting between Hindus and Muslims and so forth. And he talked often about building teams of trained people to interfere with those riots and bring peace to their communities. The week he was assassinated, he was to attend the first major international conference on Shanti Sena, which is the Hindu word for peace armies that were about to be formed. The idea didn't die with him, and it was carried out for decades in certain Indian groups, mostly surrounding what they called his constructive program of trying to make communities more self-sufficient, less dependent on authorities, and keep the peace locally. In the 1980s, a number of international groups began trying to use these ideas of nonviolent interventions to preserve the peace and preserve life in various places around the globe. Peace Brigades International, which began accompanying human rights defenders in Latin America, was probably the first of these, and they have projects all over the world currently. I worked with the initial team on Christian peacemaker teams, which has recently changed its name to community peacemaker teams in several of the places that David mentioned earlier. And the Meta Peace team out of Michigan is another one that I've worked in Haiti, or in both in the United States and in Palestine. These are all volunteer organizations that do great work and have been doing it for decades now. The fourth stream of work comes from a medical model initiated by the epidemiologist named Gary Slutkin, who looked at the data on how violence in US cities spreads and said, this acts a lot like a contagious disease. Did an enormous amount of research and found out for sure that the biggest risk for violence is not poverty. It's not lack of father in the family. It's not lack of religion. It's exposure to violence. And the data is really strong on this. If you take a study of young people in a city and see how many incidents of violence they have witnessed in their life, it's a dose-related curve that the more violence you're exposed to, the more likely you are to be either a perpetrator or a victim of violence. Very hard data. And while I haven't seen the data yet, research done on international conflicts, I'm sure the principles will be the same. The more weapons there are out there, the more people exposed to war, the more likely they will be victims or perpetrators of violence later. And since epidemiologists know how to treat contagious diseases and get results, this has been applied to human violent behavior, also with excellent results. We know how to stop epidemics. Interrupting transmission is the first thing. We all know that, right? We wear masks, we social distance, we wash our hands to stop the spread of COVID. And violence interrupters in the 80 places or so these guys are working around the world look out for people who are about to get in a fight, who are talking about retaliating against harm done to them or their gang members and so forth, and then go and engage those people and interrupt that transmission, lessening the incidence of violence. And then because most of this work is proactive, preventing future spread of violence means engaging the community people that are high risk and going to them way ahead of the time that they threaten violence, and teach and work with them to learn other coping mechanisms for whatever conflicts they're having. And finally, changing the group norms. If children grow up seeing nothing but violence, and I saw this in South Sudan, they don't know what else to do when conflict comes. And if you show them other ways of doing things, people are usually pretty happy to receive that information. Now, the group norm in the US in the last few weeks has seemed to go in the opposite direction, where mass shootings don't even make the front page anymore. So changing group norms, it can go either direction. But if we want to stop violence, we've got to change that norm to what's acceptable. Selkirk College in British Columbia in Canada maintains a database of unarmed civilian peacekeeping groups around the world. And they're in the process of updating this. And I hope some folks on this call will give us some more information about ones perhaps we haven't heard of. But right now, the list is about 80 organizations doing formal unarmed civilian protection work. Now, most of those groups, but while they may have paid staff, rely on volunteers, because the money for it just hasn't been in this yet. The two exceptions to that, where people pay their workers like any other employees and really make sure they're thoroughly professionally trained. All the groups pay attention to training and do a good job with that. The real professionals at this are the Nonviolent Peace Force, which comes from the Peace Team model, and Cure Violence Global, which comes from the medical model. And these are the first organizations to reach budgets in the tens of millions of dollars and train hundreds of people. And at that point, I'll turn it over to Charles to tell us about what arms, how it works. Charles, just say change, and I'll give you the next slide.
Oh, okay. Thank you so much, John. Thanks, David, for the introduction, and thanks everyone who's here, and also really excited to hear ideas you have and models that you've heard of as well. So in some of these slides, we'll go through some of the techniques that are practiced and what it actually looks like when it is practiced. So yeah, what is it and how does it work? Next slide.
Yeah. Uh-oh. There we go.
Oh, okay. So yeah, UCP refers to unarmed civilians protecting people in violent conflicts. So in addition kind of to the background that John has given, it's going to be some techniques that we talk about. So it works before, during, and after conflicts, but it's mostly thought during, when things are sparked off and people are being hurt or killed. So this makes UCP unique in the peace and justice field because it's solely focused on physically protecting people who are being killed or harmed. Next slide. So in the US, in local communities, cities, there are hundreds of UCP and UCP-like groups who are addressing violence. A lot of them maybe operate on volunteers, so maybe not paid staff, but we're hoping to, change that as well. But in Chicago alone, where I'm located, we have Institute for Nonviolence, Ceasefire, Cure Violence, several other groups, and we're discovering more of them all the time. A lot of these have just organically sprung up because people in a neighborhood realized there's violence, we need to do something about it. And so in an unarmed way, we're going to, we keep us safe type of model. Okay, next slide. Another aspect of UCP is that cities are trying out unarmed first responder models. So instead of you have an emergency and the police are always showing up, different models are being tried. In Chicago, they are trying out a model where it will be an armed officer with a mental health professional, but they're also trying a model that shows up with no armed officer. And so these models are being tried, and there's some very exciting things. Also, people know about other models that have happened in different states, where it's thinking, who are the first responders, and thinking unarmed. Next slide. More examples, schools. So instead of using armed guards to protect schools, UCP is being used in schools. And so in Minneapolis, where there was a move to take a different approach and basically remove all armed guards from the school system in Minneapolis. So Nonviolent Peace Force worked with this great group Emerge to basically do trainings and young people being trained in how to do protection techniques unarmed and protect themselves, basically. In Chicago as well, examples of that, but we hope to expand that. Another way this looks is, probably many of us have participated in this, is during protests or events or polls where protection is desired. A lot of people are stepping up as safety marshals. There's a multitude of individuals and organizations who are providing marshals in different cities. And another really exciting thing with this is there are rapid response marshal networks that are forming. So here in Chicago, Indivisible Chicago has been a great leader on this, where they have a large list of people in a network that they've created. And basically, when an incident happens, when something happens where marshals are needed for an unarmed protective presence, they send out a message, and all the people who are connected to that can chime in and say, yes, I'm available. Sometimes it's even the same day that a whole bunch of people can chime in and say, yes, I'll be there by 4 p.m. And so this is an exciting development too. Next slide. So now to the really techniques that we're looking at. How does it really work when you look at it? So next slide. Four main UCP methods, and this is one possible representation of a UCP methodology. There could be many others, but this is one way that groups have looked at it, is 4 kind of methods: proactive engagement, monitoring, relationship building, and capacity recognition. So we'll explore each of these. So next slide, please. Okay, proactive engagement. This is a terrific one. This is basically being with vulnerable communities. It includes presence, which is inhabiting high-risk areas in a highly visible manner. And here you see members of Mask Chicago who are out in brightly colored shirts, basically looking for very high-risk areas and going and being a presence there. There is accompaniment, and this can be accompanying human rights defenders, trial witnesses, or others who may have received death threats, things like that. So you accompany the person. And in the 2020 elections, when Cori Bush was running for Congress, Nonviolent Peace Force was actually able to do accompaniment for her because she was getting death threats. And then interposition is another aspect of proactive engagement. So this is one of the most advanced UCP techniques, and this is placing oneself between conflicting parties. Okay, next slide. Second technique can be under the umbrella of monitoring. This is observing activity within vulnerable communities. So this can include ceasefire monitoring, where you're watching to ensure that ceasefires are being maintained. Rumor control, working with local sources to verify incidents so that rumors or propagandas from different sides do not impact things negatively. And then early warning, early response is coordinating with different emergency responders, trusted local actors who can step in when something dangerous is going to occur. Next slide. And third umbrella here is relationship building. This is a really great one, is connecting with multiple sides and power levels. So this will include things like multi-track dialogue, which is opening lines of communication with all sides in a conflict. Instead of saying, this is the side that needs help, we're only speaking to this side, it would be every aspect of that conflict is a connection is made. Confidence building is helping vulnerable community members to connect and access services that otherwise it might be hard for them to actually go and get something that they need. So kind of building the confidence that services are available. Okay, next slide. And fourth umbrella is capacity recognition. This is uplifting local protection methods. So this could be uplifting and amplifying local peace structures that are already in place. And then trainings, which could be facilitating workshops on UCP or human rights or anything else the community wants. Things like helping the community know its rights and how to protect itself. Okay. So with these four kind of techniques, I would like to just put a little extra emphasis on the proactive engagement technique, because many people who get into UCP begin by learning the skill sets within that proactive engagement. And so this can include de-escalation methods. So think about questions like, how do I stop someone who's coming at me with a gun? And I'm unarmed. And there are a number of different effective techniques for situations like that. So those are trainings, and really excellent way to start getting into it. Also, each of the four main methods contains dozens of skill sets which can be studied, practiced, and innovated further. And you may have ones to suggest in the Q&A or different models that will increase our understandings as well. So next slide. Okay, so just to finish up with my portions, want to look at a couple of the principles and some of the benefits. So some of the principles that some groups operate under are nonviolence, so seeking dignity for all sides, nonpartisanship, which is to be endorsing no side, local primacy, which is being led by the local grassroots activists and partners. Transparency is being open about purpose and methods, and then decolonization, which is focused on undoing the colonial peace-building norms that may have been, actually doing harm within the peace-building world. Now, just on this slide, I want to focus, especially local primacy is a super important one we find, where it's not effective usually for outsiders to come into a place and say, we're going to keep people safe here. It's usually always great for people who know the situation best, who have the wisdom, who are from the situation, to be the leaders. And usually there are already a number of people there focused on protection. So they're leading, and that's a very important one. Different groups may operate these principles differently, especially the nonpartisanship one, but there's definitely room to discuss that more. Next slide. Just also to pull out a little bit more on the decolonization aspect, we find that violent conflicts are often a result of structural violence, which includes structures that have been created by colonization, which still affects us everywhere. So to address this, UCP groups can do a few things, maybe listen to many voices, not just those who are closest to the already status quo, established structures, to not assume that we know what peace and progress look like for a community, to reflect on the makeup of our own UCP teams and their power dynamics, and then to study and learn more about decolonization. There's some groups who have done some great studies and recommendations, and so we can share those later when we share resources. Next slide. And some of the great benefits of UCP is, unlike armed protection, UCP includes everyone in our sphere of concern from the grassroots up. So everyone's safety is important, everyone. Also, it challenges the good versus evil narratives, which can be really harmful, because if someone is seen as evil, then you're more okay with, killing or harming them. And this also gives offenders or those who may have been combatants paths back into society, one thing is when combatants have been really involved, they may think, well, there's no way back now. I'm in too deep. I've killed people or harmed people, so there's nothing else for me. But actually, some of the most skilled UCP leaders that we have are people who were former combatants, who were involved in violence, and now have found their leadership into another way. Next slide, please. And more benefits. Unlike armed protection, UCP updates our strategic thinking and our language. So, for example, we can refer to protectors patrolling a space and responding to incidents rather than police or soldiers, because this can kind of help us address the common question which people have is, well, who will you call if not the police? There was a mass shooting, who will you call? And UCP helps give a different answer to that. And then, it also involves everyone, people who are younger adults, elders, people of various abilities and backgrounds can practice UCP and can go through trainings and contribute. Next slide. UCP questions that can come up. What about worst case scenarios? People may wonder. It's a very valid question. Decades of evidence actually show that UCP's effectiveness, even in highly escalated conflicts, areas where there's war, areas where there's really intense violence. And what we often find is that armed protection does not keep worst case scenarios from happening. In fact, it tends to reinforce and replicate them. So we see them again and again and again. And armed protection was there the whole time, so it's not really stopping them. Okay, next slide. So with growth, how can we scale up the ideas and practices of UCP? I think about the fact that a lot of people in this work are volunteers and have just decided to protect their communities where they live. What about, actually that being a valid position, a form of employment? Many practitioners of UCP, once they practice it, they see its potential to replace all forms of armed security around the globe. So how would we think about increasing the awareness, the recruitment, the funding? Next slide. And when we are, thinking about war abolition, one of the things we can do is just kind of envision that world without our traditional militaries, our police forces, and what will it take to make armed protection obsolete. Some of the resources that we are going to provide here are some of the links. There's a whole bunch of different online trainings that are available that people can do if they're interested. And please feel free to suggest other ones that you know about, trainings that you've done, that you've liked, or that you've heard about. Yeah, there's a whole body of knowledge out there, and it's just kind of about increasing this knowledge. Could this be studied in schools? Could children know about this option instead of being recruited into, maybe military opportunities? Next slide. So that's the last slide that I have here, and a couple quotes that I really like here. Abolition is about presence, not absence. It's about building life-affirming institutions, with Ruth Wilson Gilmore. And then our future is either nonviolent or non-existent, especially in a world where nuclear weapons exist. Violent protection is just never going to be enough for us to protect ourselves. So we'll provide our emails, and just want to thank everyone who's here as we go into the last section where John will take us through the last piece. Just want to invite everyone to contribute, to join this movement, to give us your ideas. So just want to thank everyone. And John, I'll hand it back to you.
Yeah, I'll just add a few observations of how everything Charles just talked about worked for me when I was in South Sudan and what it looked like. there. So South Sudan is one of the world's newest countries. It was born after 55 years of mostly civil war within Sudan, between the Arab North and the African South. They finally won their independence in 2011. And as soon as they had conflicts within 2 years, they devolved into their own civil war because that's what they knew. And it was pretty impressive to see. This is Bentu in northern South Sudan, but you could see we had a grid of a town that just a few years earlier had been a flourishing commercial and residential center. And the war literally drove everybody out of their homes. And on the plain lands, and you see what it looks like, that's exactly what you'd expect. And almost nobody living there. They're all living by the tens of thousands in UN protection of civilian camps. But everybody in South Sudan I met could show me their own scars, tell me about a village they had seen burned to the ground, or knew somebody had been killed in this war. So they don't have the same view of war that the colonial powers, especially the United States, has about what a glorious adventure war is. So they were much more eager than people here, I found, to learn alternatives. And so Nonviolent Peace Force was invited by a South Sudanese group who watched them do a project in Kenya, I think it was, or Tanzania, and begged them to come. And that has grown into the Nonviolent Peace Force's largest mission, where they have about 200 people in country. And they're divided into relatively small teams of between 8 and 15 persons, who then take an area and use the methods Charles talked about to try to keep it safer. They have a very great model, I thought, about half nationals, half local people, and half internationals. So local people know the culture, know the language, and can tell people how things work locally. And having internationals, most in South Sudan, who, by the way, were from other African nations, gave them credibility because they were people outside their own village who could purport to have some expertise and increase the ability of locals to get work done. So the 4 things that Charles talked about earlier have to be translated into something that it may be more relatable to non-academics in local situations. And everybody in South Sudan is an agrarian culture and knows trees. And so the principles of UCP are the roots here. Unarmed Civilian Protection, what we provide is the trunk, and then the methods used are the 4 that he talked about with their various branches. You give whole workshops and people spend days going over what each of these means. And so that's part of the capacity building, just to do workshops for people who've never been exposed. And again, the impressive thing to me was if you give a training like this locally, you can work for weeks to get 25 people at a training on this. In South Sudan, in 2 days' notice, you could have 100 people, just because they didn't have to overcome that barrier. Well, I'm safe enough with our police and our military. They knew that war helps nobody. That's the biggest lesson they could teach the West and the global North. Although Ukraine's doing a pretty good job of that right now. So, and it wasn't people just coming in from the outside. We worked with others. In the lower right-hand slide is a picture working with a group called Safer World, which does similar things without the risky things that Nonviolent Peace Force does in terms of peace building and teaching people other means of conflict resolution. It's really a great effort. And then we picked up on the local wisdom too. That's what they're to enhance capacity that's already there that people may have had in the past and forgotten. For example, in the lower left slide, the fellow on the right is the local village chief. And his job used to be to judge most conflicts. But since all the armed actors came in with the political overlords, a lot of his power to do that was taken away, and people were just arrested or shot instead of using local traditional justice methods. I love the story about the family on the right. Actually, it's one of my colleagues, and then the people I'm standing next to was a couple who lived in the house behind us. And they were, before NP got there, they were already patrolling their own neighborhood with some encouragement from the United Nations police trainings that they had had. And the fascinating thing about spending the afternoon with them and them talking about why they go out in the evening to look for trouble and try to prevent it was to hear the fellow's father got into the conversation through a translator and started saying how he thought his son was crazy for going out after dark in these war-torn times and trying to prevent trouble without a weapon. He said, how could you possibly do that without a weapon? And it was really great to hear this local man say, the stuff I'm doing, if I tried to do it with a gun in my hands, I'd be dead. And that's a lesson that we really need to learn. Another great group we worked with was this Interfaith Council for Peace initiative. So local pastors, there was a group of about 20 of them, who spent their times outside their day jobs, going out into the bush. Charles mentioned, when people do horrible things to their communities, they're not usually welcome back in. Communities don't want them, but if these former warriors who are from the villages, but who've done horrible things during the war, even to their own people, if they stay in the bush, they're the ones that do the robbing and looting and just cause a lot of trouble that makes peace impossible even after wartime. And so these guys go out into the bush, recruit them, and they work for weeks talking the local citizens into having meetings and then do trauma healings for everybody. To participate in things with these guys was just tremendous. One of the best experiences of my life. In terms of confidence building among people, people who have been raped as a weapon of war or any of the many traumas that war always brings, often is replicated as gender-based violence and domestic violence. To have organizations, some local, some international, create management plans to teach local people, okay, somebody you think may have just gotten raped, teach them that there are places they can go for treatment, medical treatment and psychological treatment, and which organizations can supply that and how it all comes about. Gives people a sense of agency over their own lives and makes them much more resilient against outside armed problems. Monitoring, as Charles mentioned, is a big thing. We did lots of patrols, basically just walk and ask people about problems. Occasionally you bump into somebody that looks like they might have started trouble that didn't because you were there. It works well with locals or internationals, but the combination seemed to work especially well in South Sudan. And then just building relationships with people. Part of the early warning is, South Sudan, like most places like Ukraine will be, is covered with unexploded ordnance. The world is still covered with landmines that take hundreds of children's legs every year around the world. And teaching people how to look for those, especially under funny conditions like South Sudan, which is a dry versus flooding seasons, the stuff gets covered up. So you have to teach people to be careful when they dig, watch what their children do. Of course, they're all familiar with it. Just in this little thing, when we were thinking we were given information, this woman pulls out the bullet she had found that morning. Unlike the part of the rocket propelled grenade at the top there. And one of the most exciting things was the proactive engagement of the armed actors. So if you see violent trouble brewing, rather than wait in fear of whether you'll get attacked or not, you can go out to folks. This was right after they had declared one of many pieces that had failed. We went out to a village where all the people had been driven out and had not been able to go back. And the war had not waged for a couple of months. They wanted to go back, but the rebels who controlled the area, the opposition forces to the government's army, still controlled it. And we went out there with them to just host a listening session, basically. That's what it was presented as. And a lot of the guys in the audience at the top were actually soldiers in the opposition forces who had taken off their uniforms to attend this thing. And at one point, one of the men asked a question after we made our presentations, the interfaith guys and then Nonviolent Peace Force, and said, well, how can you possibly be unarmed when all these armed guys are out there? And I spoke up and said, well, one of the ways you can do that is to remind the government that they are the ones that are supposed to be providing for your safety, not threatening you. And my South Sudanese colleague ribbed me with her elbow and said, too political, too political. And I started to sweat a little bit, but then the commander of the opposition forces said, I want to thank our colleague from the United States for bringing this point up, because yes, indeed, that is part of government. And folks, if you want these gentlemen to come back into civil society and not be in the army and not continue the war, then you have to give them trauma healing and you have to find them jobs. So that just felt so good to hear that recognized in a war situation. So if this stuff works, and I'm thoroughly convinced after 30 years of being exposed to it that it does, why hasn't it grown? Why isn't it taking off? And there's lots and lots of reasons, but the one that just jumps out at you at all times is violence is where the money is. So just take the example of South Sudan, where there's over 17,000 peacekeepers and an additional 2,000 police trainers. And they have a budget of about $1.2 billion a year. The nonviolent peace force, which isn't the only people trying to build peace, but which is certainly the only one offering an alternative to at the point of violence, has about 200 people and a budget of about 12 million. So it's 100 to 1. Now, does violence seem to work and UN peacekeepers do a good job because it's a better technique or because they have enough resources to do something? And just look at the picture worldwide, right? There are about 27 million soldiers in the world. That is men and some women who have been trained to kill and destroy under orders from their politicians. And they're paid to do it for the most part. And if you add all the formal UCP teams in the world, and I mean formal ones that recognize that what they're doing, most of the nonviolent violence prevention in the world is done by ordinary people who have no idea what they're doing. It's just what they do naturally, I think, and saves us enormous amounts of suffering. But the formal teams is in the thousands at most around the world. So is one really better than the other, or is that just where the money is? To look at money further, look at world military expenditures. And this slide being a couple years old, with the Ukrainian war, this budget is going to go way over 2 trillion now for world military expenditures. The United Nations, which is the only international group whose job it is to try to prevent wars, has a budget that doesn't even show up on this graph in comparison. And then they have peacekeeping forces armed, and then there's the other budgets, but you can see where all the money is. And if we blow it up to the point, well, okay, the United Nations, the War Prevention Institute, has a budget of 11 billion or 12 billion, whatever it is, and their peacekeeping is about 8 billion. Cure Violence with its now, I think, maybe $55 million budget, Nonviolent Peace Force with its $30 million budget. This doesn't hold a candle. And this is what has to change. And the question is, how do we get that to change? So at this point, I'll stop sharing and really take questions to each of us and your thoughts and wisdom to see how we can move this forward.
Wonderful. I've got lots of questions, but I'll let other people go first. Maybe are you wanting people to raise their hand or just speak up or put something in the chat? Or
either way, there's 3 of us that can try to monitor things, so they can take a look at what's in the chat first. But if anybody wants to raise their hand, I see Al Mitty first. Al, go ahead.
Well, it's a thank you, John, for that presentation, and thanks for the folks at Nonviolent Peace Force and the Unarmed Civilian Protection outfits throughout the world. You do great work. My question is sort of 2-part. How do you begin this in a place? I saw Yuri's question in the chat. How do you begin this in a place that's already full of violence, say in a country, or how do you begin this in a place like, I'm thinking now of the United States, in a place like Chicago, or in a place like another city in the U.S. where we're riddled with gun violence and murder? So what are the first steps you do to get that going?
Charles, you want to go, or shall I?
You can go ahead first.
Okay, well, first of all, Al, realize that what has been done is possible. And South Sudan could have arguably been put up as an example of almost unending war and trauma that has affected a larger percent of the population by far than Ukraine. The only one that I know comes close maybe is Syria and Afghanistan in terms of the population percentage affected. and yet the nonviolent peace force was able to go in there and start doing this kind of work. And to me, the only thing that limits it is the fact that there are so few of them and the budget is so low. A lot of the workers who had been in those protection of civilian camps, and I saw the UN do their thing, they're always standing in their guardhouses, they're always looking armed, they're not interacting with people, they're just an outside threat, which just reinforces the whole thing. But there's a violent situation among the most violent in the world where it's also the largest UCP deployment in one place. Likewise, with Cure Violence does in American cities. I mean, they go into the worst neighborhoods, and if you look at their website, you can find all kinds of reports that from third-party investigators from institutions showing how they can reduce the violence in those worst neighborhoods. I was just in DC last month and mentioned to my junior family members where the neighborhood I was going to go visit called Trinidad. And they said, oh yeah, when we came to DC, they said, you can live anywhere in DC except Trinidad. Don't go there. Nobody wants to live there. And I went there where Cure Violence has a team now for the last 3 years and went to a party, open block party. Everybody felt happy and safe and was having a good time. It was mixed racially. And I asked people, what made a difference? These guys and gals, they made a difference. And there was a team of only 12 of them in a neighborhood of 6,000 people, and so it can be done. It's really a matter of will. I see somebody in the chat asked, well, you got to explain a lot more. Well, of course, better than any explanation is to go see it. If anybody doesn't think this works, I highly recommend you go in your nearest city that has a Cure Violence team and ask to hang out with them for a day or half a day or something. Exceedingly impressive.
Yeah, and I would just add real quick, also, nonviolent peace force, globally, when you think of conflicts, we have many, many more invitations than we can fulfill with the staff size and the funding. So there's all kinds of invitations we're receiving from different conflicts. And it's just, there's a team of about 300 or 400 employees that has to decide where, because it's long-term work. It's not just I'm going to go here. There's a lot that goes into each time that you are engaging in Ukraine. And Yuri, maybe you can kind of lead other great questions here, but Nonviolent Peace Force is working with others in Ukraine, learning from local communities there, and is going to, in a couple of weeks, is going to report back some of the progress that's being made with unarmed civilian protection in that scenario. But these are really important questions.
David?
Yeah, I'm just floored by how incredible this is, as I have been in past presentations from you, John, and others. And it seems to me that the key weakness here is vast ignorance by almost everyone on the planet. And we can't get millions of people to go even to their local city and ride along. There has to be mass media communication, right? I mean, because I hear every day but what else could Russia possibly have done? But what else could NATO possibly have done? And nobody has any idea that anything other than violence exists. And when you suggest it, the immediate response is, but they'd just be bombed and slaughtered. And so I wonder how you reply to that in those conversations. And I wonder if Nonviolent Peace Force shouldn't cut back to 11 million and spend 1 million on making brilliant videos and schmoozing journalists and pursuing some means of making people know that this exists.
Yeah, that's a great point. I once said to Mel Duncan from Nonviolent Peace Force, if only we could get a celebrity or a major legislator to talk about this, to get it in the public ear. And he was like, yeah, that's true. But our celebrities are also just the people doing this work who are protecting their communities. So it's kind of a balance. But I agree, we should figure out how to promote this, how to get it known, how to do commercials for it.
And there have been some progress. You know, Mel Duncan, who we gave the Abolisher of the Year award to last year, spent 8 years at the United Nations trying to push this. And the Security Council itself has actually mentioned in one of their resolutions that unarmed protection should play a part in peacekeeping operations. Now, it ended there. Nobody said, okay, go do this and make it happen, and no money was allotted and stuff. Likewise, there's been some recent talk in the State Department made a similar statement, again with no follow-up, but it's there for the first time. And President Biden, in his last address, mentioned violence interrupters as a potential solution to the school shootings.
There's several good questions in the chat. I don't know if you guys want to take those yourself or what.
We can try, yeah. Publications documenting results of these. The best I know is to go to the it's just cvg.org. I guess I can type that in there, or maybe you can do that for me, Charles, while I talk. cvg.org, and it'll have results and all kinds of scientific studies from the John Jay School of Criminology and so forth. They have the best data. See, the hardest thing, if you're going to an area and you're stopping violence, is to document things that never happen, right? That's why war does so well. It makes a lot of noise, gets everybody's attention, and changes things really quickly. And that's harder to do with nonviolence. But that's part of what Dave is getting at. Maybe we should spend $1 million less on one thing and get professionals to help do this. I noticed that one of our introductory speakers, and I put something in the chat then about one of the great ideas I heard was just to be a lot better at marketing, because this stuff does matter. It does work. It's just a matter of, like David said, the global ignorance of it. You know, when you have people making money on the other also, you know, it's an issue. You've got to go against that. There's a book coming out this year called Unarmed Civilian Peacekeeping, a New Paradigm for Human Security, that discusses a lot of what we're getting into here.
I see a good question from Destiny and then Michelle. Destiny asks, how sustainable are the UCP operations like you described in South Sudan? What happens when volunteers leave? Does follow-up occur? Would you like to answer that, John?
Yeah, so in South Sudan, you don't have volunteers. You have people whose full-time job it is to have that job. And that comes with the advantage of they'll be there as long as you give them a job. Most people like jobs, especially in a country where the unemployment rate is enormous. Now, people do leave. Maybe your question is more about what happens when the group leaves, the nonviolent peace force leaves. Well, I think most people in UCP would say, if we're doing our job well enough, by bringing out the natural peacekeeping abilities that people have everywhere in the world and adding our trainings of everything we've learned from everywhere else in the world, that combination of building local capacity should make us obsolete at some point and people can defend themselves. With one exception to that, and that is, we didn't mention this, but a big part of unarmed peacekeeping is advocacy. So Charles mentioned structural violence. You know, the thing that most people in the world actually suffer from is just a lack of fairness in protection and healthcare and income equality and that sort of thing. And somebody has to advocate for the people that are most oppressed with the oppressors to some extent. But even that can be done by people once they're trained and have these relationships with the outside world, then they can bring a lot of pressure to bear for ordinary people. Even in this crazy United States, I think most people, given half a chance, will always do the right thing and support somebody in trouble. It's just a matter of getting that message through the ignorance out to them. So the idea is not to be dependent on any outside organization. Now, Cure Violence offers technical support, but when they start a program in a city like DC, it's always local. It has to be local funding. It has to be people from the neighborhood that work there. So it's infinitely sustainable as long as there is the political will to support it. I hope that makes sense, Destiny.
And I would just add, Destiny, also on that example, like in the Philippines, most of the international staff are now no longer there, but the local women in the Philippines who were hired onto the nonviolent peace force staff are running the safety trainings, the meetings. They are doing everything. They live there and they're staying there. So that's sustainability kind of stays.
Brad has his hand up and there's a lot of questions in the chat.
Brad, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. You had mentioned the Washington, D.C. neighborhood of 6,000 people and 12 people patrolling it effectively. And I'm struggling to try to understand, what would they do? If you could just take a minute and kind of give us some specifics as to what those 12 people would do in a given night when they're out patrolling.
Okay, yeah, I've done that with them, so I can tell you exactly. One is when they open an office, and quite often they open a storefront office so that people know where they are and can get to them. They open that office, and then they go out into the neighborhood during the day when it's safer, and they begin. But to back up even before that, those people are hired from that neighborhood for the most part. So they don't have to spend months building relationships. They have them almost always, with a few exceptions in the medical model. And they're called credible messengers because the people know them. So they already know it. And most of them have been through the trouble that they're trying to prevent. So they really know how to relate to what makes people do the crazy behaviors that they once did. So once everybody knows they're there, then what happens is people start coming to them. I mean, they might do a patrol, and if they see two people doing a beef, they'll go talk to them and talk them down. And they do that because everybody knows them, or they might know them. But if they don't, even when they're sitting in their office, remember that third side is almost everybody else. The biggest surprise to me in studying this stuff is the number of people who actually do violence, even in the worst situations, is minuscule. Like in the city of Chicago, I think I've read something that reinforced this recently, that the number of people that do almost 95% of the violence is absolute minuscule. And almost everybody in those neighborhoods knows who they are. So people come to these interrupters and say, you know, Gerard's got a beef with Bill over here, and I think you need to go talk to him. So they go talk to him. And they are actually divided into caseworkers. So the guys that are really high risk, the guys that just got out of jail and are seething with anger, perhaps after a short-term jail stay, or just had their friend beat up or killed, those are the hot guys. And somebody tells them who they are, and then they go and assign a caseworker to them. Then the interruption part comes when all that has failed and two guys are about to clash, or somebody's about to do a shooting, and then they go up. And you wonder, you know, how safe is this? And this is the single biggest thing, and something I want to emphasize tonight is what I call leveling the playing field. And so years ago, I visited Garfield Park in Chicago, which when Cure Violence started was considered the most dangerous neighborhood there, so I was told. And after seeing what these guys do, and I'm describing to you now, you know, I got to ask them. There were about 15 of them sitting around the room, and I said, "Well, this has got to be dangerous. I mean, this is where the neighborhood where everybody gets shot." And they said, "How often do you get hurt?" And they said, "Well, it happens, but much less than if we weren't doing this work. Just living in this neighborhood without us doing this work, we'd be at more danger." That was impressive. The more impressive thing I heard is I talked to one fellow, and when I give a longer talk about this, I actually show his picture because he did a lot for me. He said he pulled up his shirt and showed me 3 gunshot wounds that he survived. And he said, "Now, it was at night, but it was my fault." You get that? He's saying it's my fault. He goes, "The guy was coming at another guy behind me. A guy in front of me is coming at a guy behind me, and he was a little too calm for the situation. When these guys are seething and raging, I'm kind of used to that, and I kind of know what to do to de-escalate them. But this guy kind of threw me off guard. And all of a sudden, he pulls out a gun and starts shooting." He said, "I could have gotten out of the way, but then somebody else would have gotten shot." So he took the 3 bullets. And I'm thinking, that what a hero. And that's what we admire the military for. That's what we admire the police for, is their willingness to put their own lives on the line to help somebody else. And I think that's the biggest thing we've got to do to make this happen, besides the marketing, which I'm beginning to think may be the bigger thing. But can we demonstrate at some point that there's enough people willing to take risks doing this, and pay them to do it at a scale where it could make a difference, and almost have a neighborhood where there's, there's a comparison between violent and nonviolent defense and see who does better. But right now, I mean, people that are familiar with pure violence in the neighborhoods, like I just saw and what I saw in South Sudan, they love it and they would gladly have more of it. But the number of people exposed is so minuscule compared to, well, the way I describe it now is, we give a talk and there's what, 23 people on this call. Zelensky gets on the global stage in Ukraine, and here 100 million people listening to him call for war and what a glorious thing, we're going to save Ukraine with war. That's what we're up against. So it's tough, but at some point we've got to grow to the point where, at least in one small place, everybody could look at that and say, wow, I like that.
Yeah, and could I just add to what John said there, because you kind of touched on it, John, with this thing, and it's Michelle's question, what about when someone's coming at you with a gun? And what we've found through these studies and practices is oftentimes, if you're trained in unarmed civilian protection and you bring that different energy to the situation, oftentimes it's an element of surprise, like, why is this person not scared? Why is this person calm? And combine that with, this person is not a threat. This unarmed civilian protector doesn't have any gun, so is not seen as a threat, but yet is also not scared. And so there's a number of techniques that we can go into in the trainings that are, when it's everything you can imagine. People coming at you with knives, people coming at you with a gun, people in situations where there were assault rifles and unarmed protectors protected a group of people from soldiers with assault rifles. And it's just remarkable when you look at the examples. Another thing, just real quick, is I know that World Beyond War has some awesome resources about World War II and how the Nazis, with all their domination and tanks and everything, and the philosophy of wanting to exterminate, still were stopped by nonviolence in innumerable situations by mostly untrained people who had never taken courses and studies and enrolled in things to study, but still stopped them. And so, kind of building on that, it is possible. There are techniques, even though it sounds paradoxical. When you dig into the work, it's almost every situation that you can imagine, there is someone who has experienced something that we can talk about at length if anyone's interested.
Yeah, I see Eddie has asked or given firefighters, I assume, Eddie, you mean an example of people who are willing to risk their lives for others. Yeah, I have no question, from what I've seen with all these groups we've mentioned, that people are more than willing to risk their life to save somebody else. I think that's almost innate to our human evolution. We had to do that a lot in order to survive as a group. When I give a typical hour and 15-minute talk to students, for example, about nonviolent action in general compared to violence, and then ask, how many of you, if we paid your college tuitions and gave you a job of years of service for each year you had of college, just like the ROTC people do, how many would do it? The overwhelming majority, in my experience, will raise their hands and say, I would do that, after me showing them the risks and the nature of this. It just comes much more naturally to people. Al, you had a couple of comments in there. If I can see them there. Congratulations on convincing your son-in-law, who is a special operations guy, that unarmed people might do a job that he thought he was doing better than the way that he was trained. Did somebody ask, what could you do if you just have a little bit of time to give to this? Think about how to get publicity out there, like we've been saying, is how to promote it. Get people like Charles and I and David to give talks to groups about how it works. Yeah, publicity mostly, and of course you can always donate to these groups to help grow. Although I don't think private donations in the long run are going to cut it. It's going to have to be, money out of security. I'm having the chapter of the book that I mentioned. My contribution is, should we be part of the humanitarian field of service, which Nonviolent Peace Force currently considers itself, or should we be part of security? Because if you look at the global humanitarian budget, everything everybody spends to help feed and clothe and take care of refugees, it's in an order of like 30 or $40 billion. I mean, it's what we just added to our military for on top of anything they said they needed. We just said, we'll take this too, just in case. And that's all of humanitarian. Whereas according to the International Economics and Peace Group, the security budget, basically the cost of preventing violence and doing violence in the world is on the order of $14 trillion a year. So I think security is where we need to try to sell ourselves, not as a humanitarian good. But to do that, we've got to find enough people to take the risks that police officers, firefighters, and the military does. And I don't think we'd have any trouble doing that.
I'd like to make a comment. Is that okay?
Sure, Kenny.
I'm Kathy Gannett, and I'm in Vieques, Puerto Rico, where we are famous for throwing out the U.S. military with nonviolent civil disobedience. And after the Navy left, because of the lack of sustainable development policy, there has been a very big increase in murders and drug trafficking in our community. Before I came to Vieques in 2000, I was active all my life. I've lived in neighborhoods because I was a poor person and because I lived in inner city neighborhoods where there was murders. And I love the presentations here because this is a very valuable presentation on very groundbreaking, very visionary. Everything you said, I can't thank you enough, Charles and John. But when the question comes up to what can I do, maybe everybody, including myself, with my great experience in working in peace building, I don't feel I'm ready to do what you're doing. I'm very afraid of violence. I'm very afraid of the most little bit of pushing. I mean, I don't know where it comes from. I think maybe we have trauma from our childhood that we don't remember, but that's how I'm at. So I'm going to tell you what I have done in my life to step up to this issue, but might help other people think they can step up. As I said, I lived in Dorchester in Boston, and we had a lot of deaths, and I couldn't just stand it. It was everywhere in the corner, people dying and around me, one block this way, one block that way. And I started working with the victims, the families of victims. And I don't think we've talked about the rights of victims and the needs to support victims of crime. We're talking, you guys are talking about it at another level, and I love that level. But I'm just going to say where I went, and it's part of your paradigm, which is bearing witness to the pain and suffering and the experience, okay, of violence. So I started a number of groups supporting victims, and I joined groups supporting victims, scholarship funds, peace curriculums in schools. But deep down in my heart, I cannot stay home when my neighbors are dying. I can't. And that's where I've lived all my life. Around me, there has been violence. So in Vieques, when the violence started getting big in 2006, I formed a group a couple of years later, affiliated with the San Juan group, that's a support group to victims. And I just go out when there's a murder, and I just stand on the corner. I feel like my presence is important, that maybe the police might not do something that they might do. I try to visit the families. And when I first started doing this work, remember, I'm not Puerto Rican. I came to this community as a peace activist and as a social justice activist. And when I started doing it, people would say to me, oh, they deserve to die. That's what the main line in this community of many, many people, and it's in every community, that person was involved, and they deserve to die. And so right now, with our work that we've done, we have raised that out of the gutter to it's okay to be a mother of a victim and come out in the community and speak. I mean, we've had public vigils, public dinners, public psychology clinics. And even if you just put the flyer up, the fact that you're standing up and offering services to victims. And we know that some of the mothers can't come into the same room because their kid killed the kid of the other mother. So we know that, and I don't have the skills for that. But anyway, I just want to say that you're giving voice to the victims. That's my slogan. I'm just bearing witness. I'm not telling you what you should be saying. I'm just saying you are a victim. Your son, where it's mostly young men of color that die, we have to just put that out there, that your son deserved to live. He wasn't a bad guy. And this sounds very simple, but I think it builds us to be able to go to the next stage that you're going at. I'm not there yet. I would love to be trained and be able to do it. But we have to say that for white people like me, who are going out and supporting families of color, I don't have to give them any answers. When I found that peace within me couple of decades ago, that I don't trust the police at all, I'm not going to them, but I can go directly to the people and I can just be present, and I am validating those lives. So there's a lot about racism here that we haven't really dealt with here. The whole racism issue of what we're talking about isn't really been put out on the table, but that's how I've dealt with it as a white person. I can't tell you how to fight the police or deal with the police or deal with the bad guys, but I hope to give you some voice.
Well, Kathy, what you're describing that you do fits very well with the third stage of cure violence is epidemiological approach, and that is changing community norms. Like you said, the violence is accepted because he deserved it, right? That's true of both sides of all wars and all violent conflicts. And you're telling people, no, your son was as valuable as anybody else. He's a human being that didn't deserve this. And that is part of changing the community norm. When people stop believing that violence is acceptable, they'll stop it. We have the capacity to stop it as a third side. Even untrained people can do it. Trained people can do it much better. But what you're doing is a big piece of that. So thank you.
Yeah, and the racism piece you mentioned also, Kathy, kind of ties to, I think David had a question in the chat about colonial peace-building norms. We find that oftentimes in peace work, the structures are established on organizations that have been set up with, white-dominated hierarchies, executive boards that are largely, people who maybe are more wealthy. And so these are peace building groups, but oftentimes set up in such a way that it's reinforcing some of the colonial and racist problems, especially the United States having such a terrible history with these problems. And so challenging that is super important, we find. And that is in Nonviolent Peace Force, we currently have a decolonization working group, which involves people from different regions of the world who are basically trying to help discuss ideas. How can we decolonize? How can we decolonize even peace work, which peace work should be a decolonized field, but we find that oftentimes it's not. Oftentimes it's still the white voices or the, even the makeup of our teams. We have to examine them and what's wrong with that picture if we're not getting everyone in the community involved.
Yeah, Paula, you make a great point on Kathy. Who knows how many murders she prevented just by taking care of that family, who then felt empathy rather than anger. And somebody mentioned with this public health approach, our health authorities involved. Absolutely. When Baltimore started its Safe Streets program, which was a cure violence model, it was run by the health department. It's currently being run by the Justice Department, but yes, that's done in some places because it's very much a medical model. These violence interrupters are like healthcare workers, community healthcare workers.
I noticed a question also from Paula. about working with countering military recruitment and the disinformation about the benefits of the military. And it's so true. Even I was just reading an article where military recruiters were disappointed that their numbers are down, and they were mentioning, well, part of the problem is a lot of families are trying to get their kids more education now instead of the military option right out of high school. They're looking at maybe going to college. And so now the US military, Department of Defense, is looking at targeting ads to parents to try to convince the parents, they said, to try to win the hearts and minds of the parents that they should enlist their kids in the military. So having another option like unarmed civilian protection that people can put their passion into if they want to protect. I think a lot of people might get into the military thinking, I'm going to go out there and protect. And then we see that that's not what happens a lot of times. So it's kind of like giving another option that people can put that passion into.
It's 8 o'clock, so nobody should feel bad about leaving, but I'm willing to stay around a few more minutes, and I see a couple of questions in the chat. I'll quickly answer if you wish. One, apologies to McGregor for calling him Eddie. John Cowan, can we convince some police who are willing to risk their lives to become UCP folk and change their uniform, take away their gun, and train them? Highly recommend you watch a movie called Soldiers Without Guns. Liz Remmerswohl mentioned it earlier. It's a fantastic. New Zealand armed peacekeepers went to Bougainville near Papua New Guinea and left their guns back in New Zealand and took guitars and had the most successful peacekeeping mission in history. And the movie documents that well. Yes, we can absolutely do that. Can we tell people, young people considering joining the military, to do UCP instead? Absolutely, you can tell them that. I do on a regular basis. Are the jobs there? There are a few. Nonviolent Peace Force always has a couple of things posted, but it's far between, and they tend to take people that have language skills. For the generic young person, no, the jobs aren't there yet. There are a lot of volunteer positions. Any community peacemaker teams, meta peace teams will take volunteers, but they're paid minimally. Yeah, that'd be great to get the jobs out there. Absolutely. And Yuri's asking, is there a short textbook on how to become a nonviolent peacekeeper? Wouldn't be terribly short, Yuri, but it would be a start. How to create a nonviolent force in your city or country. If you're looking to contain the kind of violence that Kathy was talking about, the local neighborhood violence, which is every bit as bad as military violence in a lot of places, Cure Violence are the people to talk to. They will send a team, exploratory team, anywhere they think they might be able to help. They've had teams in Iraq. They explored with the Nonviolent Peace Force of doing something in Syria that didn't come about, but they'd be the folks to talk to about that. And the effectiveness of it working, once it worked, why are they not creating their own nonviolent peace armies? Lots of reasons for that. I'll give you an example from Baltimore. So I visited Cherry Hill, Baltimore, my hometown, a few years ago, and saw the Cure Violence guys with their Safe Streets shirts on walking around, and their stickers were everywhere. And a couple of them walked up with a couple of kids in the neighborhood. And I said, do these guys keep you safe? Yeah, they keep us safe. And I said, well, and I pulled the kids aside. They were like 10 years old, little boys. And I said, how can they keep you safe? They don't have guns. And they just looked at me and they said, guns are for hurting people. No conflict resolution class, they just modeled it. The modeling that these guys do was fantastic. So later on, when I saw how incredibly peaceful this was, they say, well, this is not the way it is at night. At night, we have to go to work and work our butts off and feel a lot of risk that people will be drunk and they'll be on drugs, and it's a mess every night, but that's our job. And so I said, well, why and they showed me the data, the drop in shootings over the last 2 years they had been there. And I said, well, Baltimore's plagued with violence. Why isn't everybody eating this up? And they said, what don't you see here? I go, what do you mean? I see peacefulness everywhere. What don't you see? I don't know, police. I hadn't seen a single police all afternoon. He said, this place used to swarm with police. And then he gave me a number. He says, Baltimore City Police Department pays $400 million a year in overtime. They hate this program. So that's part of it. You know, the established weapons makers, the established security forces have no interest in seeing this grow. And that's a major barrier that we have to deal with. But because so many ordinary community people want it, I think it has the potential to do far more than we're doing so far. And that's a matter of growing it, getting the message out there, overcoming the ignorance, and getting the political will and funding for it. And like I said, when I tried some years ago to get it into DC and talk to a lot of people, it was the police department said, we don't want anything to do with it. And I go back 3 years later and there they are flourishing. And they just, in fact, I think DC was the only city I'm aware of that literally took like $10 million, $15 million out of its police budget, defunding in the only good sense, and gave it to not just mental health workers, but these violence interrupters with such a great record that I got to witness.
Yeah, and here in Chicago, you know, it's such an establishment thought process where we have our mayor, Lori Lightfoot, who was recently telling a town hall meeting, people were asking her about reducing police harm. And she said to the community members, she said, well, if you're Black in Chicago, there's only 3 ways you can get to the middle class: being a police officer, being a teacher, or being a firefighter. And she was advocating building a $95 million police academy in a community here that didn't want it. The community had no desire for this and protested it. So, you know, we're thinking, well, what about building academies for unarmed civilian protection? What about, instead of police precincts, having unarmed civilian protection precincts? You know, having maybe physical locations instead of your police building that you'll go to. So it's ideas where we're trying to, you know, flip that script.
And I think because this is so much closer to the way most human beings want to see things, that despite the overwhelmingly well-funded propaganda machine we have against us, we have a good chance of making this grow. And I see it growing even as we speak. Just if only war and a nuclear disaster will give us enough time to do it, but it's well worth working on. David said Atlanta's building a cop city training center for militarized police training. Right. And one of the things I mentioned in the upcoming book in my chapter is that I think we need to create academy too. You know, people have talked for decades in the US about a peace academy, which turned into the government funded Institute for Peace, which does some nice things, but can't speak out against war because it's against what Congress votes for otherwise. But having an academy that can take all these groups that have created trainings on this, and there are many, many of them, and putting it in one place where people could go and say, okay, I want this level. I want to be a bystander interventionist, or no, I want to be one of those guys who's willing to sit down in front of Russian tanks rather than try to kill all those Russian tanks, and get training from any level they want. And the creation of that academy, which I would have thought impossible, because to create a bricks and mortar thing, you would need tens of millions of dollars, but we could start it online, and then I think there are people that would come forward that would eventually fund it. So we'd have a real academy to train really professionally for this.
To Yuri's question about how do you prevent the use of nonviolent techniques against the enemy, weaponization of nonviolence by the military, like a strategy of the human shield. And this is a fantastic question. I think, you know, what if the military gets on to this and says, we're going to use nonviolent techniques to accomplish the ends that we want to accomplish? And John may have some thoughts, or other members here may have some thoughts on that. But what comes to my mind is that in UCP, we often start with a needs assessment where we're looking at who is most impacted by violence in this situation. So that informs us about where protection is needed. And so that's where we're going to, you know, kind of place the teams and make sure that reduces. So if the military is using similar techniques to accomplish some other end, perhaps they might do that, but we create space where the civil society, the people who are going to nonviolently resist the government or the military in doing something harmful, have their space to solve it creatively. And maybe they, part of what we do with the multi-track dialogue is it allows us to hold people accountable on many different sides, because now we have a contact with the military and we're able to question what is the purpose of this military operation that's going here to do this? And that can be questioned and held accountable a lot more so than if you have no contact that's been established. And again, they don't see us as a threat because we're unarmed and we're just there to keep people safe. So it's a complex, and probably I could give a better answer at more length, but thanks for that question, Yuri.
Yeah, on a slightly different level to that point though, Yuri, a really divisive question in the United States, even within the peace movement, is the whole question of abortion, right? Very polarizing. And I can remember when decades ago, when I first started teaching nonviolent techniques, I found a video of something called Operation Rescue, which was people nonviolently blocking access to abortion clinics. And some of the people I work with recoiled in horror, and I understand some of the segregationists in the American South use the same thing against civil rights changes. I would rather my enemies come at me with every nonviolent technique they have rather than whatever violence they choose, if that makes any sense. Because these techniques are inherent to who we are, I think we are primarily cooperative creatures, that even if our enemy opposes us strongly with something we think is terribly wrong, there's probably an element of truth somewhere in what they want. The one thing you absolutely need violence for is for a few people to dominate the many. If that's your goal, like it may be for the United States right now, that is 4%, we can police the whole world, then you can't do that without violence. But that's different from making people free or prosperous, which is what I think most human beings around the world want. All right, is that a good place to stop?
I think that's a brilliant place. Very well said. Wonderful job, Charles. John.
You're welcome, and we look forward to more of the conference.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. Really great to meet you all.
Feel free to go to the expo booths for a while. Otherwise, see you all tomorrow.